Oftentimes at Christmas, we discover some surprises in our world. But what if the most surprising things are not found in some packages? I'm glad you're here for this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob, and it's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. Let me take a moment here at the outset to remind you of our interactive teaching videos that are available for kids and families. They're found on Facebook, and so a simple search for Cabin Kids on Facebook will get you right to our page and give you access to all those resources. Now today we're starting into Advent, and as we think about Advent, we tend to think about a nice tidy package of time and energy and all of the different kinds of things that are part of the Christmas story. They seem like they're fairly together. But most of us are messier than we like to admit. Family can get messy. Money gets messy. Schedules get messy, and everything seems to be amplified around a holiday like Christmas. So what if the gift we could give each other was to untangle some of those messes, or even to see the beauty in the mess? During these weeks of Advent, we're going to be exploring that path of a very messy Christmas. Today, our friend Pastor Amanda Van Haltern will be sharing with us as we start down this road together.
When my siblings and I were little, we were regaled with stories of a monster called the Grinch. At this time, we had not been exposed to Dr. Seuss, and the Grinch was someone that my dad told us was very real and lived on an abandoned farm not far from our house. We would spend many weekends at this farm, and my dad would take great pains to expose the existence of the Grinch through various items lying around the property. So for example, he would point to old food and say that was evidence of the Grinch's existence. I now know as an adult that is clearly probably food left over from squatters or some other individual who lived there. He also pointed out, those big cinder blocks that you find on a lot of foundations. He pointed out those as they were scattered around as evidence of a fight between him and the Grinch. And guess who won? Of course, him. He also pointed out, I don't know if you remember that really old insulation that was green and also pink. And in that, he pointed out that the Grinch had shed its skin. It was very real that the Grinch had and lived in this old jail farm. I also, at one point, probably when I was about 6 or 7, discovered what I now know is a cow jawbone, but at the time I didn't. And my dad took this opportunity to say that the Grinch had passed away. And there was a picture of me with toothless, but with this huge jawbone, because I am so happy that the Grinch no longer lived. It was not long after that I discovered, I don't remember how, I think I maybe overheard a conversation that the Grinch had always been a figment of my dad's imagination. I remember stumbling down the stairs to the playroom with my brain exploding with the reality that this person who I had spent a lot of my childhood fearing actually no longer, or really actually never existed. And my little brain exploded with the possibilities of what else had I been taught to see that actually wasn't the full picture or didn't really exist, or perhaps there was more to the story. I didn't expect the same feeling of disorientation when I began to discover more about the reality of the Christmas story. When I looked at the characters that are in the family line of Jesus particularly, I began to be fascinated when I realized that these people had a lot of very obvious flaws and struggles. If you think, for example, of Abraham as part of the family line of Jesus, I would have assumed someone like him, or anyone who's part of Jesus' family tree, is kind of really great. I mean, they're in the son of God's family line. But when you unpack the story even of Abraham alone, you begin to see that Abraham had some pretty obvious flaws and struggles with faith. Now, if you haven't read Matthew 1, verses 1 to 17, I'd encourage you to maybe even pause this video and do that, because there are some very interesting and unexpected characters in Jesus' family line. Characters that you wouldn't expect, not because they're flawed, but also because not all of them seem to belong there. Some of them aren't even Jewish. And so I was shocked to discover that there's a whole lot more going on, a whole lot more of disorientation, if I can use that word again, than we really understand unless we take a closer look. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a closer look at some of the messiness in Jesus' family tree and actually what it has to tell us about his future, and even how it may be a foretelling or a prophecy about what Jesus is going to do in the future. So I'm just going to read from the first 5 verses of Ruth, verses 1 to 5. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and lived in the country of Moab, taking his wife and his 2 sons with him. This man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other named Ruth. But 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died, and this left Naomi alone with her 2 sons and her husband. And we'll just stop there. Now, what I think is so fascinating about these first 5 verses is, if I'm really honest, usually I kind of blow through them. To me, they're sort of a backdrop for the story in the book that's going to unfold. But if we slow down and pause here, these verses actually tell us a lot about what God is doing. He's setting up something pretty significant with these 5 verses and telling us about this character named Ruth and her backstory. What had never occurred to me when I was reading this as Ruth, as part of the line of Jesus, is that maybe Jesus' ancestry says more about the future than the past. I'll repeat that. Maybe Jesus' ancestry says more about the future than the past. What if, through his ancestry, he is already proclaiming his redemption plan for a messy world, because his past includes some messy people or some unexpected people? And that by including Ruth, he is prophesying the good news that those whom the world might consider outsiders and the unseen actually are critical in the family of God. Critical parts and people in the family of God. Not just the spiritual family, but including them in the physical family. In other words, Jesus' ancestry, or his past, anticipates the good news he's going to proclaim of the future. That the outsiders were always meant to be included in the family of God. And as we look at Ruth, we're going to spend a couple minutes in these few short verses that they actually prophesy, or they future tell quite a lot about God's redemptive plan for a very messy world. So let's look at 2 aspects. We're going to look at Ruth's pedigree and her position, her societal position. So Ruth's pedigree, or her background, and we're going to look at her position in society. So let's start by talking about the pedigree of Ruth. Now, I really just glossed over these 5 verses because I didn't think they were that important, and I didn't really fully understand the implications of her pedigree within her context until I began to study it. You see, when I discovered the Grinch wasn't real, I had to go back and reevaluate what I knew and reconsider it in light of new information. And I had to do the same here, which I'm going to kind of unpack together with you. The thing that we need to understand about Ruth is that she is a non-Israelite, but is not just any non-Israelite, not just an outsider, but she is a Moabite. Now, I needed some refreshing as to what the implications of a Moabite is. And so I had to go back to their origin in Genesis 19. And here we have the story of Abraham's nephew Lot and his daughters and his wife flee Sodom and Gomorrah. And I don't know if you remember this story, but they're running away, and Lot's wife looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt. And Lot's daughters had actually married men from the city, but the men refused to move. And so in the end, only Lot and his daughters escape. And these daughters are desperate for children, and we'll get to why that is in a minute in the next point. But the daughters basically get their father drunk one night, and then they have some fun with him, and they become pregnant. Now, the oldest gives birth to a son and names him, you might have guessed it, Moab. And he is the father of the nation of Moab, where Ruth comes from. So when we read that Elimelech in Ruth and his wife Naomi left Bethlehem to find better prospects in Moab, we might actually miss the reader's lip would have curled in disgust when hearing this. An Israelite who would have heard or opened the scroll and heard it read, they would have just curled with disgust that Elimelech, an Israelite and a Jew, would go and find shelter, leave the promised land, and he would choose a destination of Moab. If you stop and listen for a second, you can almost hear the question, really, Elimelech? Moab of all places? And it doesn't just stop there, because Elimelech's sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. With a history of incest in this nation, that's their origin, and a deep-seated racism for the Moabites, the ancient reader or the listener would have written off Ruth in the first couple verses for Ruth being a Moabite and Naomi fleeing Israel, the promised land, to find shelter in Moab. And yet, the story doesn't stop there. In fact, in these couple verses, the story is just getting started. Because not only are these women reviled by their peers and listeners, they receive a prominent place in the story that unfolds. In fact, this book, Ruth, is the only book in the entire Old Testament that is told from a female perspective. Of all the women in our heritage, a Jewish listener might think, why do we have to include the story of Ruth? Ruth the Moabitess. Why could we not heard more of Eve, or Sarah, or Rebecca, or Miriam, or Deborah the judge with all her wisdom? But Ruth, she's not even one of us, and she comes from Moab, of all places. She's not even one of us. Have you ever thought that before? I think perhaps, if we're really honest, that kind of exclusivity is hard to own. So maybe a better question is, have you ever been somewhere and felt like the outsider? Where you felt like you didn't fit in? You're not one of them, whoever them is. I think that has likely happened to all of us at one point, feeling like we don't belong, feeling like we're the outsider. But I wonder if this is the point, that it is the outsider, the not one of us, that's invited to become the part of the family of God. And in case you miss the implication here of what's going to happen in the future, God is using a physical truth to demonstrate a spiritual one. Could it be that Ruth's inclusion in the genealogy of Jesus is precisely because she was an outsider? Could it be that God did this on purpose? As part of his past, he includes an outsider because, guess what? In the future, he's going to include a bunch of outsiders. Could it be that God is doing here what he's going to have the mission of Jesus do? Ruth, the outsider in this story, will not only be a main character in the book, but also will choose to follow Naomi into a foreign land and lives as a foreigner in Israel. And actually, interestingly enough, Bethlehem more specifically. Might it be that Ruth could be a model for eventually what Jesus would do? Come and live in a foreign land and call it home and become part of a redemptive story. At the start of Jesus' life, while he's still in the womb, is this also not the experience of Joseph and Mary in returning to Bethlehem? We find that there is no room for them in the inn because they're outsiders. They don't have family to stay with and no place to sleep. And it was here that the Savior of the world was born, outside in a cave. And it was here that societal outsiders, shepherds, foreign wise men, they're invited to witness this miracle of God in flesh. Not the religious leaders, not the king, not even the priests are invited to witness this miracle firsthand. In other words, the insiders are not in the story. And then as Jesus grows up, he just keeps going after the outsiders, tax collectors for disciples, a formerly demon-possessed woman for close companion. I'm talking about Mary Magdalene. And was it not Jesus who engaged a Samaritan woman in the well in the middle of the day? Even she tried to correct him for his behavior, remember? The Samaritan woman says to him, "You are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you even talking for me and asking me for a drink?" I wonder if we need to recalibrate our understanding of even the Christmas story in light of this new information about Ruth really being the outsider, but a reviled outsider. It looks to me like it was always part of God's plan, that he was already doing it before we even understood that we needed to look for it. And that this is only the first obstacle in the book of Ruth that the readers are facing, that the outsider, not only that, a non-Jew, but a Moabite, was included in the family of God. That creates some messy tension. But there's also one other thing that I think is worth noting in these first couple verses, and that is Ruth and Naomi's position in society. And so I just want to reiterate those verses 3 to 5 again to you. So Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, dies, and she's left with 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, one of the name Orpah and one of the name Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and then the sons died. And the women are left without 2 sons and her husband. So I'll say it again. I just glossed over these verses, kind of like, okay, I understand that this has just happened, and now we're going to hear about what Ruth and Naomi do. But I think it's important to understand that these verses have significant information. Naomi is now a widow, but she has at least had children, and she's had sons. So in the society of that day, that meant a lot. She is, if I can say this, fulfilled her role by providing heirs. Ruth, we learn, is now not only a widow, but she is also childless. And I will say I didn't really understand this until I kind of unpacked the verse here, that she is very likely barren. When it mentions in the story that they have lived there about 10 years, there is no mention of children there. Few words, but so much is implied to the listener or the reader in that day. And I think we have to stop and read between the lines. About 10 years. The reader would know what is being said without it being stated specifically. She should have had children by now. So very likely she's unable to have children. And so we find ourselves within the first 5 verses of Ruth introduced to 2 members of the story, main characters in the book, but whom the readers at the time in real life would not have given a second thought to. Not even maybe a glance, and maybe a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, of derision. They're unseen women starting at the beginning of the book, and they're pointed out right away, and then they stay as main characters in the story. They become the entire focus of this little book. Now, I just want to stop and talk a bit about the significance of being a widow, because I think perhaps because our culture is so removed, we may not understand what this meant. When it comes to being a widow, once you lose a husband, you basically had no status. Naomi is a widow, but she is still a mother. Ruth, who is a widow and never a mother, and once someone becomes a widow, oftentimes the sons who would carry out the estate would continue to care for their mother. But now we read that Naomi has no place to go, and Ruth, having not had children, has no protection for her future. Those women in that day would have been society's unseen and unvalued, with no relationship to define them, no place to call home, and no protection from the men in their family line. These women would have been considered voiceless and valueless. Unless we stop and read between these couple verses and between the lines, we see the situation the women find themselves in is pretty dire. We have to look for the women in this story and understand that society at the time would have not had a place for them, and probably their eyes would have just passed them in the street. Ruth, not only an outsider, but a Moabitess, and a widow, and childless. For the readers of the book of Ruth, she is the most unlikely candidate for the family line of David. Like, that is some messy stuff. That is some unseen person. She's not only foreign, but she is also barren. But it is not in God's plan that society gets to define who is in and who is out, and what makes an individual valuable or not. And while human beings, we may want to label people by their race or give them value based on their relational status, in God's family and in God's kingdom, it's always meant to be different. Jesus' ancestry states more about his future than about the past. Jesus' ancestry says more about his future than about his past. Because why couldn't Jesus just have had a neat and tidy ancestry? Why did it have to be so messy? Well, might it be because God's whole redemption plan was to include a lot of very messy people? And could it be that Ruth becomes part of the family of Jesus, not so much because of who she was, but because of who she was not? Not only was she not an Israelite, but she was by all societal standards a nobody, a no one. And I suspect that she's included as part of God's redemptive plan because he wants to include outsiders with messy backgrounds. Might it have been God's plan all along to provide for his people through messy situations by including an outsider from a reviled people group, through drawing attention to those that society would gloss over? They would not see them. They had no place and no value. And then wouldn't it be just like God to intervene in such a way that only his hand is clear on this redemption story? I mean, think about where this leads, this story. Drawing attention to the unseen and undervalued. And some might even call that alone a miracle. But does this not also foretell the miracle of the Christmas story? The Holy Spirit and a pregnant virgin, angels singing in the sky, a special star in the heavens, lead some men over hundreds of miles to one small cave. I wonder when we lost the miracle of the Christmas story. And I think it might have happened when we missed how messy it actually is. Sometimes I wonder if we are the Grinches who stole Christmas. Not because we did it on purpose, but because we just heard the story so many times and maybe a bit like me made some assumptions about Jesus' family tree. And perhaps like we discovered in our couple of verses that we just glossed over some of the details. If you think about Matthew 1, all of the names there, I think if you were to start digging in their backstories, you would find some pretty messy individuals. I wonder if perhaps in our familiarity with the Christmas story, we have ceased to wonder at the miracle of the Christmas story itself. And as a result, perhaps we've stopped being amazed at our own inclusion in the family of God. Our inclusion in the family tree of God says more about our future than about our past, doesn't it? It says more about who we are called to become than about where we come from. And so this Christmas, I wonder if we might see that God's plan to include us, include the outsider with, a weird past, was already happening way back when he started to work in the story of Ruth and invited her to become part of Jesus' family tree. So here are two takeaway questions from this message. I wonder if this season we can find the wonder that anyone is invited to be part of the family tree of God. Outsiders, insiders, unseen people, seen people, men and women, red, yellow, green, and white, we are all precious in his sight. And so the Grinch is invited to the table at last. And so we are also invited into God's kingdom and God's family. Can we find the wonder that anybody, including us, was invited into the family of God? I think the second question I'd encourage you to ask yourselves would be, could it be that in areas where we think God isn't, God might actually already be working? We just need to ask to see him and to see the miracle of his intervention. Because it wasn't until I began to really unpack the story of Ruth that I began to understand that God was already working to include outsiders and unseen and unexpected people and messy pasts way before I even knew that he was at work. So I wonder if in this season there is a part or area of your life or a story that's happening that seems really messy and you're wondering, God, are you at work? I would hope that you could ask instead to say, where are you at work? And so as we step into this Advent season, I hope we can find ourselves among the shepherds who witnessed the group of angels singing about Jesus' birth. And that we too, as a result of that revelation, stumble into the stable, not to the inn or into a church, because we realize that we don't belong there. We don't belong in Bethlehem or in Israel. Really, we don't even belong in the family of God. We are not the insiders. But the good news of the season is that it is exactly that point. We, the outsiders, the unexpected people with messy past and messy history, are invited to witness the birth of Christ. And that as the shepherds came and worshipped, we too are invited to come and worship in this very messy but very merry Christmas story.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Awesome. Just before we pray together, let me just mention the podcast extras. You'll find them as a link in the description box of either YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching this video. And I would encourage you, as you go to our Kingston Standard Church site and participate with what's happening with those podcast extras, you'll discover a variety of things, like some questions that you can use as it relates to conversation related to this message at home, a variety of different kinds of pieces related to at-home worship, as well as links to our church. And so check that out in the description box of either YouTube or Facebook. Let's take a minute and pray together. God, we think about the messes that are part of our lives, and sometimes it feels like they're very overwhelming. And when we think about what is happening in our history, thank you for the fact that oftentimes what is going on is often about the way you see us in the days to come. And so we're grateful for the way that you're at work in us. I pray that you would remind us to look around for the wonder of what it means this year for us to be part of your family. And God, I pray that you would help us to be watching for you in some of the unexpected places in our lives, places where we might think that you should be at work, but maybe you already are. And so God, today as we come to you, we thank you in advance for the way that you're at work and for how you're going to continue to show yourself in our lives during this season. We love you and we thank you. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, thanks again for taking a few moments to be here with us today. It's great to be able to connect with you in this way. And before you go, if you don't mind taking just a moment to like, comment, or share this video, it's always an encouragement to us when you do, and we thank those of you who do follow through in that way. Also want to mention that if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to like or follow us on Facebook, on our Facebook page, then let me encourage you to take just a moment at the end of this video to connect in that way and to continue to connect to future posts as well as other information that is coming down the line related to our congregation. Once again, we're praying for you. We trust you're praying for us as well, and we are grateful for the fact that you've been here today, and we trust that we'll see you again soon.